What if this wasn't just about a quarterback losing snaps? What if what's happening right now is exposing something much bigger hiding inside the NFL? Because what started as a routine injury update has quietly turned into accusations that could shake the league's credibility. Shedeur Sanders didn't just fall down the depth chart. According to recent claims, he may have been pushed, not by performance, not by preparation, but by forces that have nothing to do with football. Behind closed doors, there's growing buzz that internal decisions, branding concerns, and uncomfortable optics played a role in how this situation unfolded. And now those whispers are turning into something far more serious: allegations, legal action, in a spotlight the league never wanted. At the center of it all sits the Cleveland Browns, a franchise already known for quarterback chaos, now facing questions that go way beyond play calling. Every snap given to someone else feels like a message. Every excuse raises more doubt. And looming over the entire situation is Deion Sanders, watching, waiting, and making it clear this won't be brushed aside quietly. Because if these claims hold any weight at all, this isn't just a Browns problem, it's an NFL problem. And once you see how deep this goes, it's impossible to look at this situation the same way again. But the real story didn't start with a lawsuit. It started with an injury that was supposed to be minor and somehow changed everything. When Shedeur Sanders first arrived in Cleveland, the energy felt different. This wasn't a low-expectation rookie slipping into the background. He came in carrying momentum from a high-profile college run, a polished skill set, and the kind of confidence that usually earns opportunity early. Inside the Cleveland Browns building, there was real belief that he could compete sooner rather than later. At least, that was the public story. Then came the oblique injury. On paper, it sounded manageable. Nothing season-ending. Nothing that should have rewritten the entire quarterback plan. The initial messaging suggested caution, not concern. A short pause, some rest, a chance to reset. But almost immediately, the handling of that injury began to feel different. Vague updates, no clear timeline, and a strange shift in how often Sanders was even mentioned in team discussions. Instead of being treated like a temporary setback, the injury became a quiet separator. While Sanders was technically still involved, he wasn't moving forward. Reps disappeared. First-team looks dried up. Development stalled. It wasn't a shutdown, but it wasn't progression either. He existed in this uncomfortable middle ground where he was present, yet never truly part of the plan. What raised eyebrows was how quickly the depth chart solidified without him. The Browns didn't just move cautiously, they moved on. Decisions were made as if Sanders wouldn't factor back in anytime soon, even though the injury itself never publicly escalated. No setbacks announced, no re-injury reported. Just silence, followed by distance.
And that silence mattered. Because in the NFL, momentum is everything. Timing, rhythm, trust. While Sanders was sidelined just enough to lose his footing, the offense began reshaping itself around someone else. Play calls adjusted, chemistry formed elsewhere, and by the time questions started coming from the outside, the internal story already felt locked in. Which should have been a speed bump, turned into a roadblock. Not because the injury demanded it, but because of how it was handled. And that's where the doubts first crept in. Because once fans and analysts started comparing what they were being told to what they were seeing, the math stopped adding up. And that's when the injury stopped being the headline and became the excuse. Once the Browns moved past the injury narrative, the focus shifted to a choice that immediately raised questions. With Shedeur Sanders no longer positioned as part of the immediate plan, the team committed fully to Dillon Gabriel. And on the surface, the explanation sounded simple: stability, experience, and safety. But what unfolded on the field told a very different story. Week after week, the offense struggled to find rhythm. Drives stalled early, reads came late, timing never settled. At one point, Gabriel's completion rate dipped to around 32%, a number that's hard to defend at any level of professional football. And yet, the response from the Cleveland Browns wasn't adjustment, it was commitment. The starting role wasn't reconsidered, the depth chart didn't budge. If anything, the team doubled down. Publicly, the justification stayed consistent. Sanders was still healing, the coaching staff was protecting him. Development takes time.
But the more the offense stalled, the harder it became to ignore the contrast. One quarterback struggling in real time, another watching from the sideline, fully dressed, engaged, and visibly capable of participating. The explanation no longer matched the results. What made the decision feel even stranger was the lack of urgency. Losing games didn't trigger experimentation. Poor execution didn't open the door to competition. The Browns weren't just choosing a starter, they were choosing certainty over possibility, even when that certainty was clearly failing. It sent a message that the plan mattered more than performance. Inside the building, that kind of rigidity rarely goes unnoticed. Quarterbacks feel it. Skill players feel it. When change is off the table, no matter what happens on Sundays, confidence starts to crack. And for Sanders, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't about earning reps, it was about waiting for permission that never seemed to come. As the losses piled up and the offense remained stuck, the conversation around safety quietly evolved into something else. Not protection, protection of decisions. Because once a staff commits this hard, walking it back becomes an admission, and that fear of being wrong can be more powerful than the desire to win. And that's when people stopped asking why Gabriel was starting, and started asking why Sanders wasn't. As the weeks passed, the explanation stopped convincing people. Not because it was proven wrong, but because the visuals didn't line up with the words. Every practice clip, every sideline shot, every warm-up rep added to a growing optics problem the Cleveland Browns never seemed prepared to address. Shedeur Sanders wasn't hidden away. He wasn't immobilized. He was present, moving, throwing, and standing just close enough to the action to raise the obvious question. If he can do this, why not that? Fans noticed first. Social media filled the gaps the team wouldn't. Screenshots of Sanders in full gear circulated alongside official injury updates that stayed frustratingly vague. No setbacks were announced, no timelines were clarified, and the longer that silence stretched, the louder the speculation became. It wasn't outrage yet, it was confusion turning into suspicion. Even opposing teams seemed puzzled. Comments surfaced from analysts and former players questioning why a quarterback who looked physically capable wasn't even being tested in live action. Practice reports hinted at progress. Trainers spoke carefully, never confirming he was unavailable, only that the team was being cautious. That phrasing became a problem, because caution without context looks a lot like avoidance. Inside the locker room, the atmosphere reportedly shifted. Some players kept quiet, unwilling to step into a quarterback controversy. Others, according to people close to the situation, privately questioned the logic. When performance struggles don't open doors, it sends a chilling message. Competition has limits, and once that idea takes hold, trust starts to erode. The Browns' offense reflected that tension. Predictable play calling, tight routes, defenses crowding the line, unafraid of adjustment. It felt like a team operating with one hand tied behind its back, not because it had to, but because it chose to. And with every stalled drive, the absence of Sanders became more noticeable. That's when the narrative shifted again. This wasn't just about football decisions anymore. It was about presentation, about how things looked. Because in a league where image is everything, the Browns were now trying to sell a story that fewer and fewer people believed. And once optics start working against you, the next phase is inevitable. The conversation moves beyond the field. Once the visuals began contradicting the official explanations, the media conversation took a sharper turn. What had been framed as a routine football decision started attracting a different kind of scrutiny, one that questioned not just what the Browns were doing, but why. Analysts weren't only breaking down missed throws anymore, they were breaking down narratives. And suddenly, Shedeur Sanders wasn't being evaluated like a typical young quarterback. Several media voices pointed out a familiar pattern. Sanders was being described as complicated, polarizing, or a long-term project, even as his on-field resume suggested otherwise. Meanwhile, mistakes made by others were framed as fixable, teachable, or part of the process. The contrast was subtle, but consistent, and once people noticed it, they couldn't unsee it. That's when Stephen A. Smith stepped in and said out loud what many had been dancing around. He didn't just question the football logic, he questioned the tone, the comfort level. Who gets patience in this league and who gets skepticism?
Smith argued that quarterbacks like Sanders are often asked to prove why they belong, while others are given the benefit of the doubt by default, not because of talent, but because of perception. The discussion wasn't framed as an accusation, it was framed as history, a reminder that the NFL has never been just about arm strength and playbooks. It's also about optics, leadership stereotypes, and which personalities decision-makers feel safest defending if things go wrong. In that context, Sanders wasn't just competing for snaps, he was competing against an unspoken standard. Other commentators echoed similar sentiments, careful with their wording but clear in their meaning. They talked about comfort picks, about organizations choosing familiarity over upside, about how certain quarterbacks are labeled as risks long before they ever fail. None of this was presented as proof of wrongdoing, but as a pattern worth examining. And that's what made the pressure uncomfortable for Cleveland, because once the conversation shifts from stats to standards, there's no easy rebuttal. You can't scheme your way out of perception. You can't outcoach a cultural question. What started as a benching was now being discussed as a case study, and the Browns were losing control of the narrative, fast. While the debate around Cleveland grew louder, Deion Sanders took a very different approach. There were no fiery press conferences, no public threats, no emotional sound bites aimed at the organization. Instead, he did something far more calculated. He stayed visible, calm, present, and impossible to ignore. Even while dealing with his own health challenges back in Colorado, Deion made sure he was seen, at practices, at games, on camera, always composed, always watching. His presence alone sent a message that didn't need to be explained. He wasn't there to create chaos, he was there to make sure the situation didn't fade quietly into the background. When reporters asked about his son, Deion didn't attack the Browns. He spoke about faith, about patience, about preparation. Short answers, controlled tone. But beneath that restraint was a clear boundary. He wasn't confused about what was happening, and he wasn't disconnected from it either. Every carefully chosen word suggested awareness without accusation. That's what made it effective. In a league where outrage is easy to dismiss, composure demands attention. Deion's silence wasn't passive, it was strategic. By refusing to escalate emotionally, he forced others to fill the space. Analysts speculated, fans debated, executives felt the pressure of being watched without being challenged directly. And when Deion did speak, the messages landed harder because they were measured. Phrases like, "God's watching," and "people show who they are when things get hard," weren't threats, they were reminders. The kind that linger long after the cameras shut off. The kind that shift power without ever raising a voice. It was also a reminder of who Deion is in this league. Not just a father, not just a coach, but a figure who understands how systems operate and how narratives are shaped. He wasn't fighting the Browns, he was holding a mirror up to them. And behind closed doors, that quiet pressure was starting to work, because once ownership noticed, everything changed. Behind the scenes, the situation in Cleveland was starting to unravel. What looked like patience from the outside increasingly felt like paralysis on the inside. As scrutiny intensified, the Cleveland Browns stopped operating like a unified organization and started reacting to pressure in real time. Decisions weren't being made confidently, they were being managed. Reports began circulating that ownership had stepped deeper into football operations than usual. Jimmy Haslam, typically insulated by layers of executives, was now directly involved. Sources claimed he was asking pointed questions, not just about game plans, but about optics, public perception, and how the situation with Shedeur Sanders was being interpreted beyond the building. That alone signaled unease. Inside the front office, tensions reportedly grew between leadership figures. The coaching staff stuck to their messaging, emphasizing preparation and process. The front office echoed medical caution, but the consistency felt forced. Insiders hinted at disagreements over whether the injury was still the real issue or whether the organization had boxed itself into a corner by committing too hard too early. That fracture began leaking out in subtle ways. Press conferences grew shorter.
answers became more rehearsed. When follow-up questions came, they were often deflected rather than addressed, and each non-answer only amplified the sense that the Browns were protecting decisions instead of correcting them. The locker room felt it too. Teams can survive losing seasons. What they struggle with is uncertainty. When players don't understand the why, belief erodes. According to people close to the situation, frustration simmered quietly. Not everyone wanted to speak publicly, but the confusion was shared. A quarterback competition that never reopened, no matter how poorly things went, left many wondering what actually mattered. At that point, the season itself almost became secondary. The real concern was control. Control of the narrative, control of perception, control of a situation that had grown larger than football. And the more the organization tried to manage it, the more obvious the cracks became. Because once leadership starts reacting instead of leading, the collapse isn't loud, it's slow, visible, and impossible to stop. Everything shifted when the conversation moved from frustration to formal claims. What had lived in the realm of speculation suddenly carried weight, and the stakes changed overnight. According to allegations brought forward by the Sanders family, what happened to Shedeur Sanders wasn't just mismanagement, it was part of something more coordinated, something intentional.
The claim suggested that internal evaluations, communications, and decision-making patterns may have worked together to suppress Sanders' value, not because of his ability, not because of readiness, but because of concerns that had nothing to do with performance, branding, control, optics. The idea, as it's been described, is that certain organizations and league insiders preferred limiting his rise rather than dealing with what came with it. It's important to be clear, these are allegations, not proven facts. But allegations alone were enough to send shockwaves through the league, because if even part of this holds up, it wouldn't just implicate one team. It would raise questions about how narratives are shaped, how evaluations are influenced, and whether the system truly operates on merit alone. What made this moment explosive wasn't just the legal language, it was the pattern. Supporters pointed to unexplained drops in evaluation grades, inconsistencies between on-field performance and internal assessments, and the way Sanders' situation seemed to stall without explanation. On their own, each detail could be dismissed. Together, they painted a picture that demanded attention. The scope of the allegations widened quickly. This wasn't framed as a single bad call or a coaching mistake. It was framed as systemic. A league culture that prioritizes comfort and marketability over fairness. A system that quietly manages outcomes while publicly selling competition. For the NFL, that framing was dangerous, because credibility is everything. Fans can forgive losing seasons, they don't forgive manipulation. And once legal scrutiny enters the picture, every past decision gets re-examined under a harsher light. Suddenly, the Browns weren't just defending a quarterback decision. They were standing in the shadow of a narrative that questioned the integrity of the entire process. And while executives scrambled to get ahead of the story, Sanders did something unexpected. He stopped reacting and started repositioning. As the noise around allegations and internal chaos grew louder, Shedeur Sanders took a different route. Instead of fueling the controversy, he stepped back from it. No emotional interviews, no cryptic call-outs aimed at specific people, just a quiet shift in posture that signaled something important had changed. He wasn't waiting to be defended anymore. He was reclaiming control. He showed up. Public appearances, training sessions, brand events. Each one was intentional. Without directly addressing the legal situation, Sanders reminded people who he was before the headlines took over. Clips of his college performances resurfaced online. Old interviews circulated again, highlighting his preparation, composure, and leadership. The focus subtly moved away from what he wasn't getting in Cleveland and back to what he had already proven. Social media played a major role in that shift. A single, carefully worded post hinted that this situation had grown bigger than football. No explanation, no overstatement, just enough to let people read between the lines. The response was immediate. Teammates from past programs, former pros, fans across the league. The message resonated because it didn't feel manufactured. It felt honest. What made the moment powerful was what Sanders didn't say. He didn't criticize the Cleveland Browns. He didn't blame coaches. He didn't attack teammates. By staying measured, he flipped the dynamic. The silence that once worked against him now worked in his favor. Every unanswered question placed more pressure on the organization to explain itself. Off the field, he kept building. Partnerships continued. Media presence expanded. The image of a sidelined rookie quietly faded, replaced by that of a player who understood leverage. Not loud, not reckless, just aware. And in a league driven by perception, awareness is power. By the time he spoke publicly again, the tone was calm but revealing. He talked about trust, about alignment, about paying attention to how organizations operate when things get uncomfortable. He didn't commit to Cleveland. He didn't rule anything out either. He simply made it clear that his future would be shaped by opportunity and belief, not patience without purpose. And in that moment, the story fully turned. Because the Browns were no longer deciding if Shedeur Sanders was ready, they were scrambling to prove they were. By now, it's clear this was never just about who should have been under center on Sunday. What unfolded in Cleveland exposed something far deeper: how organizations respond when talent challenges comfort, and what happens when leadership hesitates instead of committing. Shedeur Sanders didn't just get caught in a bad situation, he became a mirror, reflecting how decisions are really made when the stakes feel uncomfortable. For the Cleveland Browns, the damage isn't limited to wins and losses, it's trust. Inside the locker room, with fans, and across the league, quarterbacks don't just evaluate playbooks anymore, they evaluate stability, belief, and whether an organization will stand behind them when narratives get messy. And right now, Cleveland's answers haven't inspired confidence. Zoom out even further, and the implications stretch beyond one franchise. If the allegations surrounding this situation continue to gain traction, the NFL faces a much harder conversation about transparency, equity, and who truly controls opportunity. Because when credibility slips, everything else follows. What happens next will define more than a season. Whether it's a long-awaited start, a quiet exit, or a clean break, the outcome will shape how players view Cleveland and how the league is judged when power and potential collide. Sanders' future isn't just about football anymore. It's about respect, alignment, and whether systems are willing to evolve when challenged. So the real question isn't whether Shedeur Sanders can succeed, it's whether the organizations around him are ready for what he represents. Because once a story reaches this point, there's no going back. Only accountability or consequences.